So we gave a quick summary of these yesterday, a little bit. So master boot record infecting rootkits are more simply known as rootkits. And so this, what we would call bootkit investigation began around 2005 with EI bootroot. And shout outs go here to our own Scott Tenaglia, who is apparently, he apparently did a port of their assembly between one assembler format, NASM, which is what they use by default, over to NASM. So if you ever meet him, you can be like, man, you're elite, man. They were giving you shout outs in the first bootkit. Man, you're not worthy. All right, so bootroot, and then eventually vBootkit and Stone Bootkit, 2009. But it's worth mentioning, like for instance, this Stone Bootkit, he was really calling back to an early virus called the Stone virus, and that actually infected the master boot record as well. And so early viruses would infect master boot record in order to propagate between systems. So this was sort of a known technique from viruses from back in the day, but it was adapted for use in rootkits in order to hook into the system and change it and hide themselves and stuff like that. All right, so what does an MBR actually look like? To make things concrete, I wanted to show an example of this. And this is a pretty good site that really digs down into the master boot records for the various operating systems. And so this is what the literal hex dump of a master boot record would look like. So all this stuff in green, that's all actually 16-bit real mode assembly code. So I believe, yeah, so he has the disassembly down here, so 33C0, XOR AX, AX, blah, blah, blah. So 33C0, right? So this is all just assembly code at this point. And the point here is when you're booting up the system, the BIOS, when it's done doing whatever it's going to do, when the BIOS is finally done and it wants to start kicking off the boot of the system, it reads the first sector of the hard drive, you know, sector 0, track 0, ring 0, whatever, cylinder 0. It reads the first sector of the hard drive. Oh yeah, there it is. Cylinder 0, head 0. Okay, sector 1, whatever. Reads the first sector, puts it into memory, and jumps to the first byte of it, which is where it's going to find a 16-bit instruction. And so these are all 16-bit instructions. And the master boot record then is in charge of pulling in the next stage of things, which would be the partition boot record. So first it has to figure out which partition is currently active, which partition is going to boot. And so to that end, there's some information right here. Each of these things, 16 bytes long, is actually a partition information. So that specifies data for one partition. This specifies data for another partition. That specifies data for another. So there's kind of 4 potential partition informations. And then there's just sort of a signature here at the end. So I haven't ever looked at this to see how well this specifies it. I don't think it's particularly, yeah, not particularly enlightening. I like the description in your book. So go to page, go to page 383 in your book. Specifically, you're looking at 6-3, table 6-3. So that's showing, you know, up in 6-18 above it, you can see there's some information. There's a black 00, and then it's 0010. This is on the line that ends, that begins with 1B0. So at the very end of that line, you see 00 in black, and then 0001. Starting at the 0001, those are each of those 16-byte partition information. So then he parses it out down in table 6-3. And to me, the only part I've been using recently that was useful to me is the first bit is the boot indicator bit. So if the most significant bit of one of these entries is 1, meaning that the byte looks like hex 80, then that means this is the partition that's active right now. So you can see up here, this one has the first partition active because it starts with 80, things like that. So the problem is I've been getting stuck where, you know, my master boot record, I have to like redo my master boot record. So if you boot Windows from a recovery CD, for instance, and you issue the fix MBR command, what it's going to do is it's actually going to write this information right there to the master boot record. It's just going to like slap that information over it. So if there were a bootkit right there, you would have just wiped it out. But in my case, the issue is I'm installing something like grub right there, so I can boot Linux. But then it doesn't like grub, and so it won't boot Windows. So then I try to revert back to the Windows one, so I slap it over here. But the problem is Linux is still set to like some other partition is active, so I can't actually boot Windows because Windows' master boot record goes down, consults the partition information, and says, aha, I can see that partition 2 is where you want to go. And then it jumps to, you know, it parses the rest of this to find, you know, the sector start for the partition headers and all this sort of thing. And then it tries to load it, and it fails miserably. So hex editing your master boot record for the win. You can, you know, go down and toggle which partitions are active if you're in a multi-boot setup. All right, so that's what, you know, concretely that was what a master boot record looks like. It's a bunch of code right here. When an attacker installs a bootkit, they're changing that green code in order to basically put in, the common technique is to put in an IDT hook actually. So they're changing that code, puts in an IDT hook where the IDT is set up in a certain way by the BIOS before it transfers control. And so then this is setting it up and saying, you know, I want to find out whenever any of these, whenever any data is being read from disk. So it's going to see when data is being read from disk, and then it's going to search for particular byte strings, and it's going to put an inline hook or something else into any new code that's loading. So the way things work is that your BIOS kicks off to the master boot record. It reads in that first sector. It runs that green assembly code, 16-bit real mode assembly code. Master boot record, then, its job is to go down, and you know, it's a very small code, right? So it can't do that much. Its job is really to go down, parse that last little table of 4 entries and say which partition is active right now. And for whatever partition is active, it parses it, finds the sector information where it can find the partition bootloader, or sometimes called volume bootloader. And so it pulls that code in from whatever sector is specified in that little table at the end, pulls that information in, and then, you know, jumps to that code and lets that start running. And so we could start, you know, parsing out what the partition bootloaders look like and stuff like that. So that's why, for instance, when you're installing grub, it actually has an option. It says, do you want to install me to the master boot record, or do you want to install me to the partition boot record? Because maybe you want to leave your master boot record the same so you can boot Windows normally, but then you want to, or other times you want to put Linux, you want to put grub right here so that it can boot Windows and it can boot Linux, and it all just depends on some foibles of where Windows wants to be in terms of assumptions on the hard drive. So anyways, you know, that's where the rootkit is. He's getting in at this level, at the master boot record level. The bootkit is there. And because of that, like I said, his first job is just to read in that partition bootloader. And then the partition bootloader's job is to pull in this other part, the NT loader or boot manager, stuff like that, which loads in OS loader. I think actually those two, the OS loader and the NT loader, I think those are kind of appended together. But you can see that at some point, you know, the NT loader has to transition from real mode to protected mode. And then once you're in protected mode, the OS loader gets ready. It loads up WinLoad, and that thing then loads in the Windows kernel. So at each of these stages, each of them is passing along to the next stage. But the bootkit is in there early enough that it says, I want to make sure that I change things to my advantage at each stage. And so in the early stages, changing it to its advantage means hooking the IDT so that it can find out when the partition is loaded or when NT loader is loaded, so that it can, once it finds, unfortunately I don't remember exactly where this happens, but let's say that when this goes from real mode to protected mode, yeah, I think that's a good description. When you go from real mode to protected mode, the interrupt descriptor table entries are going to start being treated differently. So no longer is going to be the case that your IDT entry is going to call you back every time that you have data being read in from disk. So this is sort of an issue where the attacker needs to, the attacker had control at this stage. He found out every time data was being read in from disk, he could search for signatures, for instance. But when this stage goes to that stage, he would lose control. Probably going to have to do this later and fix it. But this stage to that stage, he's going to lose control. So what he does is, at this stage, when it reads in this stage and gets ready to execute it, right? So this thing has read in the OS loader. It's ready to jump to it. Before it allows it to jump to that, the attacker puts in an inline hook here so that he can be placed at whatever code is responsible for reading in the next stage. So that now he can still see when stuff is being loaded in, because ultimately his goal is, at such time as the NT kernel is loaded into memory, he needs to be sitting there waiting and having control so that he can say, you know, search the NT kernel and then find something like, you know, the code which enables the requirement of Windows Vista to sign kernel drivers. And he says, I don't want this thing to require me to sign kernel drivers in the future. I want to just drop a kernel driver on the system and run it. And so he can scribble that out. You know, he can put no ops over the initialization. He can make functions return immediately. He can do anything, right? Because when you overwrite code, you can do anything. And so he overwrites code in the kernel before he allows the kernel to start. Same thing if you want to get rid of PatchGuard, for instance, right? So in some of these proof of concept things, some of their payloads were, I'm going to turn off signed drivers and I'm going to turn off PatchGuard. So there was like a simple one that I saw recently where at the actual, I think at the OS loader level, there was something which would call initialization function in order to turn on PatchGuard. And they found that if they just turn that to return immediately, then PatchGuard never gets initialized. It's never, you know, checking if anyone's putting inline hooks in the kernel. It's never checking if someone's changing the SSD key or anything else. And, you know, you think because PatchGuard is, you know, protecting the system that it's all good, but the system has been subverted before it even started, essentially. So that's sort of the basics of Rootkit, right? So that's where the attacker gets early enough in the stage that he can hop his way along through each of the stages to maintain control so that he still has control by the time the kernel proper starts. All right, so just talking a little bit about the history here. The original EI boot root is still available. Problem is this gets flagged by our antivirus. Otherwise, I would have shown this as a simple test because the other ones haven't been working for me. And so this was actually, this was the first proof of concept where they were specifically targeting kind of rootkit-like behavior. It actually, so first of all, it didn't actually install to the hard drive. So it didn't like overwrite your master boot record on your hard drive proper. Instead, they had a boot CD where you put in the CD, you boot off the CD, and what does it mean to boot off the CD? It means that at the BIOS level, you've set some configuration that tells the BIOS, rather than reading from hard drive sector 0, I need to read from the CD sector 0, right? So the BIOS now passes control to the CD. The CD has its own, you know, quote, compromised master boot record or hijacking master boot record. And what that does then is it's sort of, it's just a little off to the side kind of thing. Bill, can we go to the board? Whereas normally, so in this case, you're booting off a CD, it's going to the CD master boot record, it's executing some code. Normally that CD master boot record would, you know, call the relevant code to start up, you know, Linux on the CD, something like that. But instead in this case, this CD master boot record goes and reads from sector 0 of the hard drive where it knows the real master boot record is. And it hooks that the same way you would if you were actually installing it directly to the system. So it makes changes to that, and then it executes that actually. So it kicks that off, and then that just does the normal thing. That kicks off, we'll say, the volume boot record, kicks off ... Eventually, it loads up NT, but actually EI boot root, for its actual payload and its demonstration capability, it's installing a sort of backdoor listener, something that listens on the network, and when you send it a magic packet, then it executes certain code to show that it's there. And so actually, what it then does is it hooks in ndis.sys. So if I were able to display my screen of my laptop over the thing, I would show this. You would see actually one specific inline hook in ndis.sys when I boot from this CD. Like, there's nothing else changed. I could go to a clean system, boot from the CD, it would walk its way through, and then eventually the only change is single ndis change.
In order to get to the MDR, does it have to load some describers or something like that? Like, how does it know the address of the MDR and get there?
Well, so that's kind of the nice thing at these early stages, and unfortunately I don't know this by memory yet until I start playing with this, but it's kind of the same reason why the master boot record in these early stages with the interrupt descriptor table set up the way it is. In the early stages, you're basically just calling a specific interrupt and you're giving it things saying like, I want to speak out on this particular channel, where the channel can be something like, this is the CD, you know, an ATA interface, a TAPI interface, whatever. So you're just kind of saying, I want to speak out on this channel, and I want this sector and this sort of thing. So at the early stage, the hard drive access is actually extremely simple. And for the same reason this guy can read in this, by just giving a simple interrupt command, that's the same reason why this can read these.
It's a function of it being in real mode.
Being what?
It's the function of it being in real mode, so like everything.
Basically, yeah. It's in real mode, stuff is much more simple. That's why, you know, back in the day with DOS, you know, anyone could write memory anywhere. They could change interrupts, and then therefore they could, that's kind of, you know, how viruses would work back then. They could change the interrupts to intercept file access and then infect things on the fly, stuff like that. So it is kind of a function of it being in real mode, which, as we said, at some point you come out of real mode into protected mode. At that point, the interrupts are working differently. All right, so that was EI boot root, and its payload was really just a backdoor in the network component, which waits for a magic packet. All right, so then there was vBootkit. This is actually the thing which coined the term bootkit, which is good, so we don't always have to say MBR rootkit. And so vBootkit, the V came from the fact that it was the first thing that supported Vista. So there are different, you know, there are different master boot records for Windows XP versus Vista. So that's not so much the hard part. The point here was to make the appropriate payloads where their proof of concept here, I believe, was turning up. The point was to say, look, I'm loading code on Vista despite the fact that you have a requirement of signed kernel drivers, right? So I'm bootstrapping my way into the kernel. I can do whatever I want. I think their payload here was the sort of foo DCOM token elevation privilege. So periodically it basically just walks through the process list, finds anything that's command.exe, and elevates the privileges of all command.exes to system. So if you boot from a rootkitted system, your command.exe always turns, you know, it functionally becomes root all the time. So that was vBootkit, and vBootkit 2 was then the first thing which supported Windows 7, but also x64 mode. So then its payload was disabling signed drivers, disabling kernel patch protection, and still having like that capability to elevate processes and stuff like that. So those were interesting proof of concept things. I think vBootkit actually did work on 2000 XP and Vista or something like that. So it did support other ones, but it was the first thing to support Vista. All right, and then Stone Bootkit was 2009, so it was kind of 2005, 2007, 2009. So Stone was, you know, in my opinion, it's kind of a weaponized bootkit. It basically, he took these previous proof of concept things that vBootkit and EI boot root. He took them and he made it much more modular so that you could basically plug in assembly modules to have whatever payloads you want for when it finally gets into the kernel, or like I said, so I could bypass TrueCrypt. Because let's go back over to the board. like I said, I hypothesized, I haven't looked it up, hypothesized TrueCrypt is either putting in its own custom master boot record or putting in a volume boot record. I would guess it's here because you can put much more code, but if it's not, this code here would still really just be bootstrapping some eventual thing. And so the issue was, I was talking about how by hooking the interrupts, it can see when this is read in, it can search for strings if it needs to do things. But the point is, there's that cut partition where at some point, you know, protected mode versus or protected mode versus real mode. At some point, it's going to lose control when it, you know, it has control based on hooking the interrupts. At some point, it's going to lose that control. So it's wanting to read data as it's coming in so that whatever's on this side of the barrier, it writes inline hooks into that, so it still has control, so it still has code executing when you jump over into protected mode, right? The problem is when you have things that are doing stuff like full disk encryption, if this thing is transparently decrypting data as it's coming off the disk, even on this side of the thing, on this side of the cut line, when it's seeing data read in, the data coming back from the interrupt is encrypted data, right? It's still encrypted. It's only when TrueCrypt handles the interrupt that when TrueCrypt is given the data, that it decrypts it and then, you know, does whatever next. So really, if we say, I don't know how I'm going to draw this. You've got encrypted line here, and you've got a decrypted line. So you get an interrupt, and you're still on the encrypted side of the line. And then there's going to be some TrueCrypt code. And then that's going to put you over to the other side of the line, right? TrueCrypt is going to be what decrypts it. Therefore, really, the attacker needs to be right here, and they need to put themselves there so that they can see, eventually get themselves onto the other side of this partition as well. So this thing also included modules to deal with that, and I would expect a similar methodology would work on most things. I say that, but for instance, I believe he had said that on stuff like BitLocker, so Microsoft's full disk encryption thing, because BitLocker is actually making use of the Trusted Platform module, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, because they're using the TPM, BitLocker would be doing verification where it's saying, you know, does everything back here look good before I'm even allowed to use my decryption key? So BitLocker won't even get to use its decryption chain first looks good. So we'll talk about that in a second. So things like BitLocker would be defeating this, but that's because it's more like things like TPM can defeat this. All right, but anyways, Stone Rootkit had various interesting payloads. All right, so in terms of stuff that's actually in the wild for rootkits, so those were all the proof of concept, you know, make a talk at a security conference kind of things. I just pointed out that this link from the Gmer side had a good dissection of the first master boot record thing found in the wild, this mebroot, and also called other things and associated with Torpig or Sinowall botnet. So I believe the Trojan/botnet was Torpig, Sinowall, and the mebroot was the thing which was brought along with it to hide them. So I just want to show this quick. This analysis at the Gmer site, it shows how this first thing which was in the wild was actually pretty much the EI bootroot code, just modified slightly. So someone took that, said, hey, that looks like a good idea, and then started using that. So on this side is the original EI bootroot code, and it's got its, you know, 16-bit assembly. And then on this side is the mebroot code. So all of that looks the same, all that looks the same until the only thing different here is this clear direction flag that they put in there. But then we go down here, that's the same, move, ds, bx, etc. All right, so this is a little different. This uses a deck. This uses a move and a sub, and move, sub, and a load s. But really, like, huge swaths of this code are basically all the same. So that's like, a bunch of that's really all the same. So that was just that's a little analysis of thing in the wild. Also TDSS, or TDL3. I think this link, maybe I'm not, maybe not. TDSS was the first thing in the wild that actually was able to infect 64-bit systems, so it's sort of like vBootkit 2. It supports x64 systems, and that's relevant because other rootkits, if you don't start at these early stages, you can't just load your normal rootkit on something that requires that has PatchGuard turned on and signed kernel drivers turned on, right? Maybe you can sign your thing with something, steal a certificate like Stuxnet, but you can't then hook into things, right? Well, of course, then Stuxnet got around that by doing IRP hooking, which is something PatchGuard was not looking for. And actually, the funny thing here is that in both of these cases, these in the wild things, they do sort of end up using IRP hooking. So although they're potentially using a good method of subverting the system very early on and keeping control, ultimately when they get into the system, what are they doing? They're just doing the same old IRP hooking. So we already know where to look for IRP hooking, right? You just run things like virus blockade tool, Gmer, and you can go see what's actually either what's being called for the master for the major functions, or what's in the chain that maybe isn't in the chain on the next machine over. So those are the in the wild examples of rootkits. All right, so there is this master boot record detecting. So there is this specific version of Gmer standalone application which will search for master boot record infections. But I'm pretty sure that Gmer has that built in right now. I'm not 100% sure because I wasn't able to get any of those proof of concept code to actually run inside my VM. So, but Trend Micro actually has pretty decent, their rootkit buster thing has decent removal capability. It's not on the order of virus block 8 or anything because they're erring on the side of only remove stuff that we really know is bad. But that at least claims to have MBR rollback essentially to those clean versions, right? And theoretically, it should be pretty easy, right? I said there's, this is the Windows XP master boot record. This is the Vista one. They're on those boot CDs when you boot off of them and do the fix MBR command. I should probably put detecting/prevention and add the fix MBR command here, because when you boot it off the CD, the attacker is not necessarily able to intercept your writes and see that it's being overwritten. But then the other way to go about things is to use the TPM and start using systems that have trusted boot. So this is not a full trusted boot system, but Corey Kallenberg whipped together some code which can actually go out and inspect the platform configuration registers from the TPM, which are basically registers that hold measurements. So I need to go to the board quick and describe some TPM stuff. So the TPM is a separate chip out on your motherboard somewhere. I think, is it LPC bus? TPM is a separate chip outside of your CPU or anything else, and it has some basic crypto capability. It has some basic storage capability. The key thing that we like about it is the fact that it has key generation capability where it can generate a private key, public key pair, but it can keep the private key in this little microprocessor out to the side and never export it through any software means. There's no command which you can give to a TPM to give it to give up its private key. It keeps the private key, and it has the requisite circuitry in order to do things like digital signatures through RSA or something like that. But for purposes of trusted boot, the interesting thing here is the platform configuration registers. So you've got some number of PCRs. Those are registers like any other register. They're volatile memory. They get reset on reboot. But when we have a trusted boot system, so you kind of get the initial part of trusted boot for free just by turning on your TPM. So if you go into your BIOS, you turn on your TPM, it'll automatically enable some code in the BIOS, which is called the core root of trust for measurement. Core root of trust for measurement. So there's a little subcomponent of the BIOS called core root of trust for measurement. Just by turning on the TPM, that enables this core root of trust for measurement. And what that code does is that code is aware of the existence of TPM. It knows how to speak directly to the TPM. And what it does is it basically measures this stuff and hashes it. So hash all of this thing, the core root of trust plus the BIOS. Yeah, I think it maybe hashes these separate. I can't remember. Corey, ping in on the chat if I'm misdescribing this. Yeah, I'll say that it's doing those separately. So it first hashes the core root of trust for measurement, and it takes that and it puts a SHA-1 into there. So it does a SHA-1 of this data right there, puts it into platform configuration register 0. Then it does a SHA-1 of that, and it puts it into there. In reality, okay, I should, all right, I'll be meticulous about this. In reality, the way that putting values, so you don't actually just write into these PCRs, because if I could just write into these PCRs, then any attacker could go in there and put any value he'd like in there. So instead, when the TPM gets reset, the PCR has the value 0 in it. And what you do is you take a SHA-1 of this, and there's this operation called extend, and that's how you actually write into a PCR. And what it does is it says the new value for PCR 0 prime equals SHA-1 of whatever you want. This is a variable, and here we're going to say this is the SHA-1 of core root of trust for measurement, concatenated, so this is a concatenation sign here, concatenated with the current PCR 0 value. Whatever is already in PCR 0, which at time of reboot is going to be 0. So this is going to be 0, this is going to be something. Concatenate those together, take SHA-1 and put that into the PCR 0. And so you can see that the reason why this is preventing an attacker from just coming in and writing any value they want to the PCR 0 afterwards is because if the attacker wants to change PCR 0, he has to do this calculation again. He says extend it, it does a SHA-1, and this is, the attacker has to calculate something concatenated with the current PCR 0, where when you SHA all of that, that would be equal to the value that he wants in there. And we know that from cryptographic hashes, they're, I don't know, Carl, you'll correct me on this if I'm wrong. They're, or maybe that's him who's always correcting people. I think this is pre-image resistance. So it's saying if you have some value here that you want, pre-image resistance says that it's computationally infeasible to figure out what the value should be that you must hash in order to get the desired value. All right. No corrections on the line. So anyways, when you turn on trust, so just by turning on your TPM, automatically kick off the CRTM. That measures itself, puts it there. Registers the BIOS, puts it there. So it measures itself before it allows any of the BIOS code to run. measures the BIOS before it allows any of the BIOS code to run. After having measured the BIOS, then it transfers control, which we're going to put as a red thing here. Then it transfers to control to some other code in the BIOS. That code runs, does all the major stuff in the BIOS. But a part of that is that is going to, before it allows the master boot record to run, it's going to again do a SHA-1 of it and then extend that into some other register. So it's going to the BIOS, like we said, the BIOS when it's done, it reads the master boot record up into memory, and normally it would just jump directly to it. But when you have your TPM turned on, it hashes it, doesn't extend into some specific PCR, so you get a hash of what that master boot record's, data was. That gets put into the PCR, and then it transfers control to the master boot record. Now, unfortunately, this is the point at which the TPM-aware code is done. So at this point, if you want to extend the system further, you have to have TPM-aware master boot record, which measures this before it transfers control. And then this has to measure the next thing before it transfers control. And that's how you can get an unbroken chain. But even just turning on the TPM, you automatically get measurements up through the master boot record. And that means if someone changes your master boot record, you would see a change in the hashes which get put into the PCRs. So Corey threw together some code which all it does is it goes out and says, dear TPM, tell me what your PCRs are. So this is not a trusted boot in the sense that you would like those values to be signed by a key that you know is associated. So you'd like to have a public key associated with a private key. Private key would be held forever in the TPM. And you'd say, dear TPM, sign those PCRs with your private key. And then you would take the public key to verify the signature and say, yeah, that really came from that TPM. But this just goes out and says, at least let me see what the values are in my PCR. Because if I went across all of these machines right now, if I'm getting different hashes for the master boot records in here, then there's something up. So nice and easy here. He created something called inspector. And yeah, okay, so he clarified the reason. This is in his transfer folder, and there's a password on it. It's I have the power 111. So if you want to grab this from Corey Kallenberg's transfer folder, password is I have the power 111. That's the password on the zip file in his transfer folder. And that's only because this instDriver.exe, actually, I don't know, Corey, I ran this and Symantec didn't complain about it. I'm going to disable Symantec just in case, but sometimes it says this instDriver, which all it does is it loads up this TPM driver. But like I said, from rootkit.com, so it must be bad. So run.bat will load up this will run instDriver, which will load the TPM driver, which will talk to the TPM and say, please tell me what's in your PCRs right now. So I run that, loads it up, and these are the values in the PCRs right now. So a couple of interesting things worth noting here. So we see these values multiple times, there and there. So there's just copies of the same thing. Overall, we only seem to have 4 unique values here. So there's this 0th one, which I said I believe is the core root of trust. Got this 1, 2, and 3, which I think is the BIOS. 4, which I think is the configuration of the BIOS. So it can actually tell you if someone goes in. So I believe that's the NVRAM. So it's the non-volatile RAM, but it's only non-volatile as long as you have a battery plugged into your machine, right? So it's got the tiny little battery that keeps the NVRAM having electricity so that it can keep your BIOS configuration, and that holds the stuff like if you're booting from CD or you're booting from disk. So if someone goes into your BIOS, changes it so that the CD boots before the hard drive, you can detect that because that'll be a change in there. All right, and then I believe this one right here, 5, is the master boot records hash. So basically now if we ran this across all the machines and if we were seeing this 5 was different across things, then we'd be suspicious that something has a different master boot record. We'd want to go inspect further. So this is at least an initial cut of a way that you can be checking MBR across systems, because this hash is taken before the master boot record gets control. So if you have a bootkit installed, this hash is taken, it's put into the TPM, before the master boot record runs, so that even, you put this hash in there, the attacker could run and they could try to change the PCR if they want, but the problem is that pre-image resistance. They could try to extend something to PCR5, but they need to find out what this question is, so that SHA of that value plus, concatenated with SHA of something else when hashed equals, equals this value. Equals some good value, I guess, mixing things up here, pretending that the attacker was installed there. All right, so that's one way you can go about detecting master boot record infecting rootkits. All right, and so I guess I had this slide which is just kind of talking about what I just talked about, where you start at the hardware at time 0 when you reboot your machine. PCRs all get either set to 0 or F. So we saw that in some of these things. Some of these have 0 by default. All these ones up here have 0 by default, and some of these higher ones have F by default. Doesn't really matter, but they all get set back to default states at time 0. Then the core root of trust for measurement gets kicked off. That's right here. And it says it measures itself in the BIOS and it puts those into PCR 0. Then it transfers control to the BIOS, where the BIOS measures option ROMs, like I was just talking about, PCI expansion ROMs, anything that's sort of a little plug-in for the BIOS to initialize, PCI cards and things like that. And then it appends the measurements of the option ROMs plus the BIOS to PCR1. Now, I should say that these right here, these say what's supposed to happen per the spec. Don't, take this with a grain of salt. I don't think this is necessarily exactly accurate. Second, this thing called the OS loader, this is actually just the master boot record. So it's only measuring the master boot record, putting it in one of the PCRs, and then it says, passing control to the OS. Well, we know that there's this breakpoint here where the master boot record passes to volume boot record, passes to NT loader, passes to OS loader, passes to win load, blah, blah, blah. All of those phases pass the master boot record. In order to get this chain to continue, you would have to have TPM aware things. So I said in the BitLocker case, over to the board. I don't even know exactly where it is, but so BitLocker is over here somewhere. It's doing this transparent encryption, decryption of things. But because BitLocker is TPM aware, it uses a different capability to TPM called, what's it called again, where you lock in a key to the TPM. Anyone? 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 No? People on the thing? No, it's when the PCRs have to be, so at the seal and unseal. There we go. Yes. Okay. Sealing and unsealing. There's this notion in the TPM where you can seal some data into non-volatile storage in the TPM, and you're sealing it under the assumption that you're saying, dear TPM, please store this data for me. And I want you to only ever release this data to me if the PCRs are in the same state that they're in right now when I'm sealing. So I can only ever unseal the data if the PCRs are in the same state. So when BitLocker comes along, when BitLocker initializes, you run BitLocker, you start it up. All of this stuff is, on a BitLocker system, it has to do measurements of things like this as well. It adds in potentially a volume boot record measurement, stuff like that. So the point is, when BitLocker comes along and it says, I'm going to start encrypting your hard drive, it knows at this state that there's a measured boot right now. And it says, I'm going to just assume that that's good. Whatever this is, I'm going to assume it's good, and that's what I expect in the future. Otherwise, I'm not going to decrypt your hard drive. So it assumes this is all good in that it says, take whatever's in those PCRs right now. Here's my key for doing hard drive encryption. I want you to store this key for hard drive encryption, and I only want you to ever give it back to me as long as these PCRs are in the same state. And for the PCRs to be in the same state, got to have the same BIOS, got to have the same master boot record, got to have the same volume boot record. All of those have to be measured to cause the same hashes to occur in the TPM. And if that's the case, then BitLocker can come along, issue unseal, and it can get back its key in order to do the decryption, encryption of the hard drive. So because it's requiring this certain state, now if, for instance, maybe a MBR, I don't know if this is true or not. Theoretically, if a master boot record infecting rootkit was already installed at the time that it seals the key in, maybe it would persist. I kind of doubt it though, but that's just to let you know that if you, for instance, enable BitLocker on some clean system, you're locking yourself into that state. You know, you're not going to be able to dual boot it or anything like that, but you are going to detect any BIOS attacks or MBR attacks or anything. All right, so one last thing to talk about, and then we'll take a break. So I pretty much I did cover all of the rootkit type stuff that I'm going to cover in this class at this point. So all the SSDT stuff, IDT stuff, IIT stuff, up through bootkits, that's about where we're going to leave it. And so you can see we're not, I originally thought I was going to be able to get into ring -1 rootkits in here, but not so much. So again, any questions on any of the stuff we've covered throughout this class so far? All right. So the last thing, this is just a miscellaneous thing. Thus far, we've definitely been focused on what does the attacker do when they get into the system. To roll it back at least one level, so we're still not going to talk about how does the attacker get onto the system, for instance, whether they have an exploit or they stole someone's password or anything like that. But we will just talk a little bit about how does the attacker load kernel code, for instance, if they want to be a ring 0 rootkit, right? And so the main way that an attacker would do that is through the service control manager. This is the legitimate way that kernel drivers are loaded on a Windows machine. So SCM, the benefit to an attacker, the pros of it, is that it is, the official way, it's the supported way, it works, it's reliable, stuff like that. The cons of it is that when you load something through SCM, it leaves a registry footprint. So there's a registry key somewhere that says, here's all the stuff, here's all the kernel modules that I want to load at start time. Or, SCM is beyond kernel modules. It also does some user space services as well. But the key point is that when you say, I want to load my kernel module at boot time or just on demand or anything like that, you'll leave a registry footprint. So that's why things like Hacker Defender, they use SCM, they create some services, but then they also make sure that they hook registry reads and writes so that they can hide the fact that they have created a service, right? So leaves a registry footprint, but if you're a rootkit, point is hide that registry key, right? And so if you go in right now and you list what's on the system using the normal tools, if you go and look at the registry, you're not going to see it. So I want to look at that quick just so we can see the cross-compare between, what a normal tool would see and what something like Gmer sees. So in your VM, let's see, I'm going to quickly take you to the quote, or not quote, just I'll show you where in the registry the actual service information is stored. So if you do run and pull up regedit, so go to HKey local machine and then system and current control set right here. This current control set is actually just sort of an alias. It's actually pointing at one of these two things above it, control set 1 or control set 2. There's two of them because one of them is just whatever the last successful boot was, and one of them is whatever your current thing is. So it keeps kind of a quote, known good version so that if your system isn't working correctly, it can drop back to something that doesn't load a particular kernel module, for instance. But anyways, current control set will always alias to whichever of those two is being used. So that's what you want to look at. So expand that and then expand services. And now this is sort of the exhaustive list of all of the services which are registered on the system. So for instance, right now, if I scroll down to basic, I know that this is one of the ones that I added. This is the basic call gate, I believe. So you can see it's not trying to hide itself at all. This is one of those proof of concept ones that all it does is go in and do one specific thing. So, you know, there are many different ways to persist on the system, and there's many different ways to do loading the kernel code. But you can see I was very lazy with these, and most of these I was quite lazy. And I just used SCM to load them as normal things under the assumption that they would look basically like just some system component to you, and you wouldn't know exactly what's supposed to be on the system. Therefore, you wouldn't know they're not supposed to be on the system. So if I scroll over, I can see the full path to, that's where the basic kernel driver is. Right here, this start field. You can Google this, but there's just a few different things. Actually, it's probably in the book on that page 199. Book on page 199. I'm pretty sure this goes in order. At the bottom there, where it's saying the start parameter, there's boot, system, auto, demand, disabled, stuff like that. Pretty sure boot is 1, system is 2, auto is 3. Things like that. So boot means start this service, which means load this kernel driver at boot time. So system's booted up, load up the kernel driver. And so these are just different levels of when they get started, essentially. So the earliest you can start is by setting something as a boot load driver. So if you set system, it would wait, it would let the kernel start doing initialization, and then it would do it. All right. So these are the things which are currently defined. I'm going to just scroll down to the H's. Let's see, HI. All right, so here's G and here's H. So GPC and then help service. So right now I don't see Hacker Defender through this thing, but it turns out Hacker Defender is installed. It's just hooking, it's injecting itself into regedit. It's hooking the calls to read registry, and then it's hiding the results for that. It knows here's where my registry keys are, and then it hides them. And it can do that all from user space. So that's what regedit sees. All right, so what does Gmer see? Well, if I just click off everything in Gmer except registry, and then I do a scan. Actually, let's see, services is what I'm going to do instead. I click on services and do a scan in Gmer. Hoping this is sufficient. Yep, there it is. All right, so these are two of the things where it's saying, you know, it definitely knows that it's bad. And what it's showing right here is there's one service that's set to auto start, and it's named Hacker Defender 100. And there's one service set to manual start, and it's named Hacker Defender Driver 100. And each of those has associated with it these particular, you know, this one has a driver, this one has an exe. And those entries are in the registry right now. So those entries are in the registry, it's just you can't see them with regedit, can't see them with things like auto runs. And unfortunately right now you can't see them with VirusBlock Ada. They don't have good registry parsing at this point, so these would also be hidden from VBA. But the key point is here, SCM is a big target for manipulation and for hiding things. So it's going to be the most common way that stuff's going to start up kernel drivers. And if they do that, they're either A, going to try to blend in and just look like some existing component. So going back to the Stuxnet stuff, if you read through the thing, it says it just starts one of these services through the service control manager. So it just says, hey, I'm the MRX net service. And I think the reason why that matters is if you go right here, right, you'll see there are existing services that are legitimate Windows services for MRX dev and MRX SMB. Those are legitimate things, so when you just see another MRX net, you know, who are you to say that that's bad, especially if it's digitally signed and all that. So here's another one of our things, MS DirectX. That's a hidden, that's using DCOM to hide itself right now. That's actually the Fudo driver. Using DCOM to hide itself. The interesting thing here actually is Fudo is loaded by user space application foo.exe. Foo.exe just uses the programmatic way of calling Service Control Manager in order to say, all right, I want to register a service. I want to load my driver, this driver right here. drivers msdirectx.sys. I want to load my driver, but then it immediately, after it loads, it says, I want to now delete my service. The thing is, SCM, when you're doing it programmatically, it doesn't delete it out of the registry immediately. Instead, it just sets this delete flag to 1, and then on the next reboot, it deletes it out of the registry. So it's actually still kicking around here, completely unhidden, sitting in the registry. So looking at the registry for anything that has a delete flag set right now is a good idea, but you know, you're probably never going to catch that, because that means rootkit's installed, but they just haven't rebooted yet. So. Now that said, if they're using something like this delete flag, they must have some other way of persisting, right? Because their driver is not going to get loaded automatically, but maybe their exe is going to get loaded automatically elsewhere, and that exe will again start the driver, you know, delete the service and stuff like that. How does Gmer detect the hidden registry settings? I believe, but don't quote me on this, I believe it's going to go directly to disk and parse the registry files off of disk. So these things, so Hacker Defender right now is hiding things when you're calling the like ZW query key, and you're calling system calls to read the registry to basically let the OS parse it for you. But I think Gmer is actually going to the registry file, parsing it, and saying, you know, what does a system call show me, and what does my manual parsing show me? Cross view detection, you can see that something's hidden. And specifically, that's why they have that services tab, is because they know that that's going to be a common target. You know, you can hide things anywhere in the registry, and you will, if you go back and run these things again, you will see stuff hidden elsewhere in the registry by Vanquish and whatever else. But services was a particular one that they focused on, because they knew that if people use the legitimate SCM method of loading kernel drivers, they're going to probably want to hide their driver in the registry. All right, and so I'll come back to this point a little bit when I cover auto runs. I may even cover auto runs next. So that was the first legitimate way. So that's the legitimate way of loading kernel drivers. Now there's a couple other ways. One of them is ZW set system information. So this is something Greg Coughlin found and posted to BugTrack back in 2000. And this was just, he was, you know, back in 2000, reverse engineering stuff, looking for good rootkit targets. And he found with this one that there was actually a particular input you could give to this in order to specify a driver file, which would then get loaded into memory. Now, there's a caveat to this, in that this driver file, which gets loaded into memory, gets loaded into paged memory. So that means it gets put into memory, but this memory can be kicked out at any time. So if you're loading a kernel driver, which is, for instance, going to put an IDT hook, you don't want that IDT to, like, that IDT code, which gets invoked when an interrupt occurs, you don't want that to get kicked out of memory, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get it in time, and you're going to crash the system. So the attacker has to be aware that their code is going to be loaded into pageable memory. But that said, if they're doing something like key for hook, you know, automatically copies itself into non-paged memory. So they could just use the same sort of strategy. They load up through this, they get loaded into paged memory, they copy themselves into non-paged memory, and then they just, you know, unload or delete their existing memory. And so the thing here would be that, you know, this obviously does not have a registry footprint. Well, it's not obvious. This doesn't have a registry footprint. So this is just a sort of weird back-end system functionality that he'd found, and will load up the code for you. All right, so that's one way. Another way is you can directly call ZW load driver. This is actually the kernel side function that's used by Service Control Manager in the back end. So when Service Control Manager loads something up, when you ask it to from user space, it's actually calling ZW load driver, and eventually in the kernel that gets called. But that's really just a way, if you would only go directly to ZW control driver, it still, I believe, has a registry footprint. It still requires all the same stuff that Service Control Manager requires. I believe it's just you would use it to sort of obfuscate what you're doing, to make it not clear that you're importing functions for doing SCM or anything like that. And then on Windows systems earlier than Vista, you could go directly to the physical memory and hack code directly into the physical memory and have it executed, as long as you knew where instructions would be jumping and stuff like that. But that's not a particularly, it's certainly a way that doesn't require registry things, but it's much more complicated, and it's more more prone to crashes, and also, again, it's you can't get access to, I guess the benefit of this at the time was that you didn't need elevated privileges to access /device/physical memory. So any compromise of the user account at any privilege level, you could then get this code into the kernel, right, which is a nice thing. But as a Vista, you need to be running as an administrator anyways, and if you can run as an administrator, you can use other techniques that are less hackish and more stable, essentially. So these are, though, the